Hi YouTube, welcome back to Wtf Rc Cars. So we're carrying on with the KYOSHO Optima Mid 60th anniversary one, and we got to part 29 I think it was. So we'll be moving on and see how close we can get this thing to finished. So let's bring you in for a close-up look and we'll crack on with build. Alright, so first thing we're going to need to do is get these two little plastic bits cut off the tree. And they go on there. Then for the bottom of the shocks, we've got these tiny little sort of cone shaped shims. We want to put one of the screws through a shock, and then we can get that on the bottom. Then if we line that up with top, it goes on the innermost of the shock mounts. Once we've got that lined up, you should be able to line it up with the top of the shock mount, and then its turners. We just need the small lock nut, and that just needs tightening up. And I must admit, they don't seem to hold on really tight on the top, but again, don't go crazy over tightening these, because all you're going to do is crush the little plastic bit. So they do fasten on there, but I don't think it's going to take much to pop those shocks off. But that should be our front suspension. So we'll do exactly the same on this side and get it all fastened up. So once we've got the front suspension built up, that's pretty much what we should be looking at. It does feel really, really smooth. Don't think these would take much knocking off at the top though. But let's carry on. So again, with the rear shocks, first we're going to want to place our little plastic tops on. Then we're going to want to get a rear shock. On these, it's turners we don't need any shims, and the stock setting for these will be the outermost hole on the back. So we just need to get that roughly into position, and we're going to need a 2mm hex driver, and then we just want to get these screwed in. So once we've got this bottom screw tightened up, we've then just got to put this little lock nut on the top. And again, on both these there's a warning in the manual not to over tighten, mainly because the top one you're going to crush a little plastic bit that holds your shock, and the bottom one you're going to rip the threads out. But we now have working rear suspension, so I'll get the opposite side one put on and we'll see what else we've got. So there we have it. We now have working front and rear suspension. It does feel really smooth, and as yet these shocks haven't started leaking, which I'm surprised at, because they've not got a reputation as being the best. But I do like using the MR33 O-ring grease, so maybe that's going to help us. So that is step 31 complete. So let's carry on, see what else we've got. Right, so for this one, I'm going to be using one of the 99 mod servos, 25 kg one, brushless, and the around £30. And I'm going to be using just a different aluminium servo horn to what comes in kit, just because it looks nicer and it really matches the servo. So first thing we need to do is get the steering bar, or the link that attaches the steering, connected. And for this we're going to have to screw these two little things on. And one strange thing I've noticed is that these actually have a dot. Now I don't know if I completely missed it on the other ends, but they've also got the smooth ring as well. So we want to get this screwed together, and for this one you're going to want a gap of 24mm once they tighten down. So we'll get that put together and then move on. So once we've got this assembled, I've got the dot facing down, and I'm going to get one of the little ball joint ends and just clip that in. Then we're going to want to make sure our servo's been powered up and centered before we start assembling this. and it's a bit strange. It does show you to fit the servo arm slightly forward, which on this servo it does seem to line up with splines. So once we get that in, let's get it screwed down. And the servo screw does not come with the actual kit, so you'll have to use the servo arm screw that's supplied with your servo. And this one is the design that's got the tiny little pinch bolt, so I like to get it pretty snug down, then tighten the pinch bolt up. And these aren't particularly strong servo ones that I'm using, or servo arms, but we have got a pretty good servo saver setup on this RC, so I'm not really concerned about it bending or breaking it. So once you've got the servo arm in place, it does tell you to lean it slightly towards that side. We're going to want our servo mounts, and on these make sure your hole is towards the center. So then we're going to want one of our little screws and a washer, and we're going to be mounting these to the top holes on the servo. So it's a little fiddly for me to try and get it on camera, but I'll do my best. And for these, I'd just sort of snug them down, don't tighten them up fully until we've got it in the actual chassis itself. And I'm still wondering what these two little tiny O-rings are for. I've been double checking the manual and hopefully I haven't missed putting them in anywhere, but up to now I've not really seen anywhere that they go. So we just need to snug them down. Then we're going to be fitting the little tiny ball joint for our servo arm. And it's just a tiny little screw. Does strangely have a 2mm head on it though. Just be careful again not to try and over tighten this, because there's a chance you'll strip the threads out of the little ball connection. So once we've got that all assembled, next thing is, with us dock facing inwards, we should be able to clip that on. And there we have our servo assembly all made up and as link. So let's move on to step 33. So for this one, we're going to want to get the servo in place, or at least try and line it up. Now looking at this, I don't think this servo is going to fit with the servo brackets on the way that it wants it, but it would fit if we flip them round. So, and this is going to be very dependent on the size of the servo that you're fitting. They're all going to be a bit different. Of course, up to now, what I've found is there's a sort of a huge difference in the depth of the servo from the brackets to the actual servo head. So for this one, I'm going to want to mount the brackets in front for this servo. So if we just take us brackets and spin them round, just leave that a little bit loose. So depending where you need to put these brackets is going to depend on the height of your actual servo itself. But if you find, like I did, it doesn't really line up, you can always flip it round. Then if we turn over, and for here we're just going to get one of these screws, get one side started. Now this is why I say leave the servo brackets loose, because they might not fully line up, and if you tighten them all the way up, you'll not have any play in them to get them lined up with the actual hole in the chassis. So once we get these tightened up, that gets the servo held in properly. Then if you just loosen them off and then tighten them back up, we can then get the servo fastened in nice and snug. So lastly, we need to fasten this little ball joint down to the top of the steering. Now it does have like a little inserted space for it to drop into, but it's going to be fun getting that lined up. Then from beneath, you've got a tiny hole in the bottom of the chassis. So you need to get the screw up through the bottom of the chassis, then up through the steering assembly. This is going to be awkward to try and get on camera, but it comes all the way through the steering assembly and the chassis, and then into the bottom of the ball joint. And if you just carefully screw it on, you can get the ball joint to drop into its place. So not the easiest thing to show on camera, but basically you've got a hole through the bottom of the chassis, you've got to get the screw up into this little ball joint and get the ball joint seated in the servo saver assembly. But once you've managed that, we should have working steering. And these are incredibly quiet servos. 25 kilograms of torque will be plenty for this sort of setup, and they're plenty quick enough. You could use a short servo, and if you get a servo with a shorter top, you'd be able to bring it in a little bit further, but it shouldn't really matter. We've got the motor on this side, so it's kind of offsetting any weight balance. But let's carry on and see what else we've got. So for this part, we're going to want the top deck. We're going to want a 3x5, I believe it is, millimeter screw. Then we're going to need the antenna mount, our bracket, I think it is. And you're definitely going to need to put this on first, because I don't think you'll be able to get to it once you tighten the top plate up. So make sure you get it on, get it nice and tight, because I don't think there's going to be much option for moving that once you get the top plate on the RC. So let's move on, see what else we've got. So moving on to fitting the top plate, we're going to have to slide this underneath the drive belt, and then you want to line it up on the chassis. Then first off, we've got these two big countersunk washers that are going to sit right up front. Then we've got the two bigger screws, and for these have got 3mm heads, and these are going into the plastic front bulkhead, so it's not necessary to thread lock these, but I do think they've kind of missed a step or missed something in the instruction manual. For this RC that comes with the metal plate up front here and the metal standoffs, it does tell you to thread lock the screws in the metal standoffs, but I would also thread lock the screws that go into the metal plate at the back. So for these, we're going to use the 2mm hex driver, and I'm just going to put a tiny bit of thread lock onto these. What I like to do with the likes of this top plate is just get most of the screws kind of just snugged up, not tight, and then you can go through tightening them all once you've got them all in, and you know everything's lined up and in place then. So we've got these two screws, this one, but only the four towards the rear are the ones that I'm going to be putting thread lock on. And I'm not fully tightening any of these down until I've got all 6 screws fully in place and you know that everything's lined up. Then we can work our way through and just finish off tightening these up. Don't forget, you don't have to go insanely tight with these. Your thread lock's going to hold them in, and then your front ones are into a plastic bulkhead, and these are quite big chunky screws anyway. and you don't want to over tighten these. Although the big chunky screws, they are quite fine thread, and you don't want to be taking your threads out your bulkhead. So that's that set done. Let's see what else we've got. So now we've got the top plate on. One thing I have noticed is the servo arm is slightly too long and it hits the top deck. So I'm just going to quickly drop that off and see if I can either shave the top of that arm off, or if not, I'm going to have to swap it back for the stock plastic one. So definitely something worth bearing in mind. You certainly can't go any longer than the stock arm on it. So I've just very carefully dremeled the end down. So now we should be able to put it back in and it should clear the top deck. So we now have a lot more clearance. Not sure if you can see, but it does clear it perfectly well. I could have probably left a bit more on, but it looks nice and tidy, shaved down that way. So we've got screws in, got a servo travel sorted, a steering can now move nice and freely, and I wouldn't be worried about it damaging a servo with these servo savers. It is set quite free, quite loose to start with, so you should be good even if you've not got a very expensive servo in here. But let's crack on, see what else we've got. Right, so moving along, we've got to get our little sticky seal bits on here, and it says we start off with an A strip, so that'll be one of the long ones, and apparently these go all the way to end. So if we carefully start off by putting this in and trying my hardest not to stretch these out at all. So then we need another A, so we just need to work these down, try not to get them twisted. So that's 2 of the A seals used. Then we've got to do this final little piece here. So it tells you need A parts, but I saved some of the offcut from the lower guard, so we should be able to use the A offcuts from the other guard. So we've got them on, and we just need to cut these off at the ends. So once we've got them cut off, it then says we need 2 D parts. So these are the small separated parts from there. And I believe these go on the downside of the back of this. So we should be able to just drop them into place under these top seals. Then we're moving on to the E parts, which are from the end. So we need 2 of these, and we've somehow got to drop these down inside here, which is easier said than done when I'm trying to line them up and get it on video, but basically should drop down into that slot, and then on the back we've got another one. So for this one we got to somehow get it down into position, and it should stick itself inside. So that's one part done. Then we're moving on to this. We need another of the E parts. So this one needs to go into that little slot, and then it's telling you to finish the rest off using A parts. So if we start from as low down as we can get, then we're going to have to try and cut it. then we're going to have to get another A part. And again, if we try and cut it, then we just need to try and get the final part squashed in here and just carefully cut it as well. And we should end up with this foam seal all the way around. So let's move on and see what else we've got. Right, so we've got to position this underneath to line up with M4 holes with the space to the front. So let's see if we can get that underneath. So once you've got that underneath, you then need to get this positioned from the top and make sure we don't get the belt caught. So once we get that in, then got to make sure the bottom is in place, and then you want the longer of these thinner screws. So I think the best thing to do with this is get one started, then try and line another up. That'll stop your plate falling off the bottom. Then we can try and get the top parts lined up. There's not an awful lot of wiggle room with this to get your finger under there to line it all up. And you really don't want to be over tightening these, else you're definitely going to put too much pressure on it and split it, the cover. So all we're looking to do on this is just carefully nip it together. So if you just slowly work your way around, just tighten it up a little bit at a time. And then if you keep having a check underneath, you can see when you've got it sort of tightened to the face of the carbon, and at least you then know that your foam is squashed and it should be making a good seal. But once you've got that tightened down, then you can move along to the rear ones. These are much shorter, and it does say in the instructions if you strip the sort of hole in the carbon, you can put a little bit of super glue in it and that will reinforce the hole, and then you can put your screw back in. And again, when you're tightening these down, just be very careful you don't over tighten it, because you don't want to really strip the carbon hole and you don't want to put too much stress on this plastic cover. I think it'd be really easy to strip the threads or strip the actual cover, but that's what you should be left with. So we've got as steering, as top plate, as cover on as belt. Still not tensioned as belt yet, but if you try and move it, you can make sure your belt's not catching anywhere or anything. Right, let's see what we've got next. So it's now time to set the tension on the belt. So we need to remove the screw that locks it in place. So that should come out pretty easy. Yep. And then it's telling us we need to tension the belt till it's on the 8th hole. So looks like it's telling us to tension it till it's about level with the A. So what we should be able to do is put a flat blade screwdriver in it, turn the tension till it lines up with our 8th hole. Then we're going to need to pop our screw back in. And you don't need to go crazy tight again with that, because it's just nipping it up. And that should have took the slop out of his belt. It doesn't feel too tight, and it does feel like his belt's now not flopping about everywhere. So next thing it's telling us to do is to remove the rear right hand shock from the top. So we need to take the locking nut off this one and just remove our top shock, or the top of the right hand shocker. Right, so once that's removed, let's see what else it's got in store for us. So we're now going to be moving on to fitting the motor, and for this one I've got the 15.5 turn KYOSHO Le Mans motor. So we're going to need to get 2 of our motor screws in, and we can just get these so they're slightly snug, so they hold your motor level, but we can still slide it backwards and forwards. So if we look on this side, I'd have liked to have the terminals further up, but the next spot round where the screws line up, this terminal would definitely hit this bar, which we don't want. It would restrict the size pinion that you could run. So now we're going to put the pinion on. We've got a tiny little grub screw and our 25 tooth pinion gear. So I like to get these somewhere near lined up. The pinion gears do tend to be tighter, wider than your spur. Now you can put thread lock on these, but I've never had to with anything so far. And how I like to set the mesh is get it almost tight, and then you can just back it off ever so slightly. That to me is too tight. I like to have a tiny bit of play. So you can just feel the pinion and the spur rocking. But you want as much of those teeth touching as possible and still keep a tiny amount of play. If you have these too tight, they're just going to run red hot, and your motor will get hot, and the pinion will get hot, and then your spur gear will melt and shear off. So you want the tiniest bit of play, just so you can hear it rattle. But that gets our motor fitted. So now let's have a look what else we need. Right, so we have found out where these little bits go. So basically we're going to stick a screw through each side of this cover, and then somehow on the back of each one of these screws we've got to place an O-ring. Which is going to make screwing these in interesting. Not sure if them O-rings are going to stay on or if they're going to split, but we've then got to place our cover, line it up, and we should be able to screw these in. And again, like all these screws into the alloy and plastic, I wouldn't try and push me luck and go too tight with these, because you're probably going to shear something off or strip threads. But once we've got that done, we should be able to slide a shock back on. And I'm guessing now we're probably going to struggle screwing this back. Yep. So looking at it, I'm guessing even making slight changes to the RC, like tightening your pinion up or swapping pinions, it's not going to be what we used to in modern RCs, where it's just very quick to sort of swap these things out. If you are running with this cover on, it's a bit involved to get to your piston or just tighten your slipper up. Many of the modern RCs would have like a little trapdoor on the end of this cover, so you'd have a trapdoor on there that you could get to the nut and tighten your slipper up. Not the case with this, so probably going to be one of them that you're going to have to run and tweak it a bit without the cover on. Certainly might be worth doing it first time you run it, drop that cover off that way, and then you should be able to set your slipper and check your pinion and everything. But it's looking more like an RC, So, in the interest of keeping these videos down to what's a watchable length, I think we'll leave it there. We've got up to part 37 and it's coming along. We've now got motor and that in. So, thanks again for watching WTF Rc Cars. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, share to friends and family, and catch you guys next time. See how this one turns out.